On the sidelines of President Trump's first ever state visit to India, I'm joined by a very special guest from his team. U.S. Energy Secretary Dan Brouillette joins me for an exclusive chat. Secretary, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be with you.
You're in India, and this is your second visit, I believe, to India. What's been your experience like this time around in terms of enhancing energy cooperation with India? What can we look forward to?
It's been great so far. It's only going to get better from here. The United States and India have established a great energy partnership. President Trump and Prime Minister Modi in particular have become very focused on energy policy and energy economics, and that's been the focus of my visit here.
Secretary, what can we expect in terms of enhanced energy cooperation between India and the U.S.?
Well, I think what we can see is a continuation of the great relationship that was established by President Trump and Prime Minister Modi, and importantly, the good work that's begun between our two ministries. The Energy Ministry here, led by Minister Pradhan and also myself in the U.S. Department of Energy. We established an energy partnership in 2017, and from that partnership has come things like a natural gas task force, which has produced economic activity on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. So just today, as part of the work that was initiated under this gas task force, we saw an MOU signed by Exxon, Chart Energy, as well as the oil company here in India. And we're going to see those things continue.
Last year, India's oil imports from the U.S. jumped considerably.
Yes.
Has there been a commitment made on increased supplies from the U.S.? And if you can share some details on the numbers there?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, since 2017, we've gone from roughly 26,000 barrels per day being imported from the United States to India to nearly 260,000 barrels per day. So it's nearly a tenfold increase. And we do expect that that's going to continue as the economy in India continues to grow by leaps and bounds.
But during this visit, no number was discussed in terms of how much that increased supply would be like?
No, not a specific formal agreement on a number, but we do know that that number is going to increase just given the size of the Indian economy and the pace at which it continues to grow.
What about cooperation in the field of natural gas? Because India does want to become a gas-based economy. What has been agreed upon on that front? Sure.
Well, for natural gas, we're seeing India change its portfolio mix. So much like America, and that's one of the reasons why President Trump and Prime Minister Modi have such a great relationship, because their approach to energy is nearly identical. President Trump refers to his strategy as all of the above, which includes natural gas, renewables, nuclear, all forms of energy. India is moving to increase its natural gas portion of its portfolio from roughly 6 or 6.5% to 15%. That's an enormous increase, and the United States is perhaps best positioned to fill that that need for the Indian economy. So we're very excited about that. And again, this is all work that stems from the Natural Gas Task Force that was put together at the U.S. Department of Energy and the Energy Ministry here in India.
What about shared technology transfer when it comes to, helping the Indian government explore more on domestic shores?
So not only in exploration, but other types of technologies as well. So again, going back to that portfolio, as they tend to increase not only production here within India, they also are changing their mix and they want to bring on more renewables. The United States is very well positioned to help satisfy some of those economic needs as well through the use of technology. One of the things that we do at the U.S. Department of Energy is artificial intelligence. We do that very well. We have two of the fastest supercomputers in the world. The application of AI to the integration of renewables into the electric grid is absolutely essential. And I think we stand very well positioned to help India with that transition as well.
Right. Countries like India, China, or big oil importing nations have been hit quite hard because of the sanctions on Iran. I know it's the US's maximum pressure policy, but it has been quite disruptive in terms of managing their needs. How does the US feel about the disruption that this decision has caused for oil importing nations?
Well, I'll start by saying, one, sanctions does not fall within the U.S. Department of Energy's purview, if you will, so I have to defer to my colleagues at the State Department, the Treasury Department, to answer precisely on that question. But what we've seen in the world oil markets is that the world is producing more oil than it ever has in my lifetime at least. So in the United States, roughly 13 million barrels per day, and that production is going to continue all throughout 2020 and perhaps even increase increase in 2021. So the ability to replace oil as a result of sanctions becomes much, much easier. And it gives not only our president, but future presidents foreign policy options that they may not have had just a decade ago or 2 decades ago.
Secretary, you spoke with my colleague Hadley Gamble just a few days ago at the Munich Security Conference. A lot has changed as far as the coronavirus situation is concerned since that interview. Are you concerned about the rising cases in Italy, South Korea? Has the risk of a contagion gone up?
Well, I'm not a medical expert, but we
No,
do.
you're not, but it does impact your
watch it
assessment
very closely.
on energy demand.
We do watch it very, very closely, and you know we're watching very closely to see what President Xi does in China, how they contain the virus. And there's 2 really important points here. One, we need to learn more about the virus itself. How does it spread? Who is affected most easily by this virus? And then 2, what are going to be the governmental reactions to it? You know, what types of actions is the World Health Organization going to take? And I think what we're seeing so far is that it's still at the margins in terms of its impact on the energy markets. Now, I realize that there are traders who, you know, make their money hedging bets. That's much different than the actual demand, the actual supply of oil and gas being provided to the marketplace
itself. But it can disrupt world oil markets, primarily because OPEC has just come out and said, look, oil demand is going to be sub 1 million barrels per day for this year. But you're still maintaining, in that interview with Hadley, you did say that this year you're going to pump 13 million barrels per day, and next year you can want to increase that production output. How will you manage to do that at a time when, you know, there's so much concern about slowing demand?
Sure, 13 million barrels per day, not 30.
Yeah, sorry, 13 million barrels per day.
I just want to make sure we were correct. Yes. No, I think, look, you know, you know, we're not a state-run enterprise. The energy industry in America is not a state-run enterprise. So, you know, in other countries where it may be a state-run enterprise, they can take aggressive steps to protect their position in the market. But, you know, if our production continues to increase in the manner in which the Energy Information Administration tells us it will, then we will be replacing some of the oil that is coming off the market. So as market players make decisions to back away based on a demand curve or based on, you know, a situation with coronavirus, I can almost assure you that U.S. producers will be there to fill that gap.
But what will compensate for the slowing demand from China? Because that's the market, that's one of the largest consumers of oil, and that's the market that's been hit the hardest. So what will offset essentially the gap that China or rather the situation in China creates for the oil market?
Sure, the growth in India and the growth in the United States. So President Trump and Prime Minister Modi have done a great job of growing their economies. And what we're going to continue to see is as those economies grow, that demand curve is going to continue to increase.
Okay, back home, we just had Senator Bernie Sanders come fresh off from the win in Nevada, and he's been talking about, of course, very actively pushing for the Fracking Ban Act. 570 regional groups, regional and national groups, mind you, have supported that act. If the movement gets bigger and its influence more widespread, will the administration consider scaling back on fracking activity in the U.S.?
No, my instinct says no. I mean, this technology.
Why does your instinct say no?
Well, because this technology has produced the economic boom in energy that we've seen over the course of the last decade. You know, there are some who disagree with the technology, but none disagree with the pricing that we're seeing in the marketplace today. So our ability to produce in the manner in which we've produced over the course of the last, you know, call it 5 or 6 years, has resulted in lower prices, not only for Americans, but for consumers all across the world. So, you know, we would disagree with those who would suggest that taking away this technology is the right thing to do. You know, these are important technologies. We're going to continue to advance these types of technologies so that we can continue the production numbers that we've seen over the course of the last few years.
The only counter argument there, Secretary, would be it comes at the cost of climate change. And, you know, this climate crisis that the world is facing. National Geographic put out a note on the same, that the rising methane levels in the atmosphere can be correlated to fracking activity in the U.S. and China.
Well,
isn't that a concern?
No, it isn't, because, you know, it can also be argued that natural gas replaces many of the more carbon-intensive fuels around the world. So to the extent that natural gas replaces those, we have seen reduced carbon emissions, not only in the United States, but all across the world. And if you look at the United States record in particular, you will see that the Trump administration strategies have been working. This all-of-the-above strategy has produced not only an increase in the size of our economy, but a 14% reduction in energy-related carbon emissions. So we know that it works, and we also know that it works around the world.
I'll just take two last questions,
Sure.
Secretary. One is, as far as port infrastructure is considered or is taken into account in the U.S., what is being done in that regard? Because development of more ports in the U.S. to load oil tankers to service the growing demand in Asia. What can you tell us about investment there?
Sure. Well, one of the challenges we face in America is not production. It's actually infrastructure. So, when I was growing up in Louisiana, we were building import facilities all along the United States coast to bring in natural gas, to bring in crude oil. That's turned around, and now we're building export facilities. But our biggest challenge in the United States is getting the product to market. It's not producing the product. So we need pipeline capacity. We need export facilities. And the president has made this a priority for his administration. So we're working closely with Congress, we're working closely with the industry to produce more infrastructure in America.
Okay, my final question is on U.S. sanctions that have been imposed on Rosneft's trading company. Financial Times carried a report saying that Rosneft is looking to defy those sanctions and continue to do business with Venezuela. If that report is indeed true, what will be the U.S. administration's pushback to such defiance?
Well, I'll leave that to Secretary Pompeo and Secretary Mnuchin. Those are my colleagues who run the State Department, the Treasury Department, respectively. It's their job to do not only the imposition of sanctions, but also the enforcement of those sanctions. But I can speak broadly for the U.S. government. Our maximum pressure campaign on bad actors, it will continue. So that includes not only Venezuela, but Iran as well. The malign behavior that we have seen from these types of dictatorships must end. So the maximum pressure campaign that the president has initiated will continue.
And if there's defiance, will there be additional punishments?
Again, I'll have to leave that to Secretary Pompeo and Secretary Mnuchin.
All right. Secretary, thank you very much, sir, for your time. Really appreciate it.
Hey, thank you. Very kind.